A Chinese businessman and suspected spy who had previously been known only as H6 due to a court order protecting his identity has been named this afternoon after he waived his right to anonymity.
Yang Tengbo was banned from the UK last week amid claims he had also formed an unusual degree of trust with the Duke of York, Prince Andrew.
One of the Duke's advisers had said that Tengbo could act on Andrew's behalf when dealing with potential investors in China. He was invited to the Duke's 60th birthday party in 2020, also visited Buckingham Palace, St James's Palace and Windsor Castle at Andrew's invitation. A letter from Andrew's aide, Dominic Hampshire, was discovered on Tengbo's devices when he was stopped in 2021. The letter said, "Outside of his closest internal confidants, you sit at the very top of a tree that many, many people would like to be on."
Tengbo was first prevented from entering Britain in 2023 by the then Home Secretary Suella Braverman. The Home Office said he was considered to have engaged in covert and deceptive activity on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party.
Tengbo then brought an appeal against his exclusion from the UK, but judges ruled on Thursday that Braverman had been entitled to conclude that he represented a risk to national security, and he was granted an interim anonymity order.
Now, after he was named online and with the threat of politicians using parliamentary privilege to do so, Tengbo revealed his identity and issued a rebuttal of all the allegations, saying, "I have done nothing wrong or unlawful, and the concerns raised by the Home Office against me are ill-founded. The widespread description of me as a spy is entirely untrue." His rebuttal went on, "The political climate has changed, and unfortunately, I have fallen victim to this. When relations are good, when Chinese investment is sought, I am welcomed in the UK. When relations sour, an anti-China stance is taken, and I am excluded."
The former Conservative leader, Sir Iain Duncan Smith, has said that the alleged spy could be one of many such Chinese agents operating in plain view. He joined us in the Daily Tea studio this lunchtime just before Tengbo had been named.
This man is a part of a thing called the United Front Work Department, and that is an organisation that reports back essentially to President Xi. They are about 40,000 strong globally. And they have a budget of about $3 billion a year. Their purpose is to infiltrate various political and other bodies that are decision makers in countries. So the establishment and others is where the Duke comes in. And all of that is what they're meant to do, and bring back information, or also look to see whether or not they can tie others in to more aggressive spying for technology, etc. They're there also to try and help postgrad students from China get jobs in things like defense contracts. They are the movers and the shakers of the way that Chinese secret processes work within other countries. They're not all directly spies themselves, but they're those who are initiating other access as well. So getting in alongside the Duke of York would have been a pretty good coup for them, and that would have therefore meant that they would be acceptable in other places. So now you see pictures of them attending parties with two ex-prime ministers, whether they were ex or not at the time, I don't know, and even George Osborne at the time, probably of the golden era, terrible thing, but that period as well. So this is really about what China really does. So all this stuff about the Labour government wanting to get closer to China, what I've constantly and others have been saying is, look, you can't get too close to China, because what happens is they carry on, but as you get closer to China, you ease off on all those other protections. If you're not careful, then they just take advantage of it, which is what they've been doing on technology, on IPs, you name it, they're in there. And this is really a process. I think President Xi is meant to have referred to them as his magical unit, because they produce results all over the world, because they think the West is very stupid. They love to meet new people like this from China. They want business in China, so they're going to bend over backwards for them. And that's really where we were just beginning to get away from before the last election, late in the day, I have to say, because I was very critical of the government then, only to find the Labour government seems to now look a bit like a sort of George Osborne tribute band when it comes to China. We've gone back to the golden era in everything, not just name. So this is a real problem, and the government doesn't seem to have woken up to the fact this is going on in plain view the whole time. I mean, we have had students from universities, Sunday Times did a couple, I think, about 2.5 years ago, getting in on defence contracts. They're postgrad students, but they were educated in the intelligence universities in China. They have special universities for those going into the intelligence services. And they're the sort of people that occupy the United Front. And yet the government just seems oblivious to this. And the last government was pretty oblivious to it till finally the Home Secretary decided enough's enough. But and then there's the other bit of this, which is that the last government had created this national risk register, and it just was about to be implemented this year, but the election took place earlier than anticipated, and it's sitting there. And the Labour government has said, oh, it's not fit for purpose. That is complete bogus nonsense. They just don't want to do it. They don't want to do it because they're now scared stiff of upsetting China. It's like the Chinese embassy, this huge, great embassy they want just opposite Tower Bridge, which is in fact the old property of the Royal Mint, a very historic site. This has been turned down twice now by the local council. Many of us say this is not the right place for it to be. But all of a sudden, the Foreign Office steps in and gets the Deputy Prime Minister to call it in. So the government will now decide. And what was the first thing that the Keir Starmer said to President Xi when they met in Rio, before the cameras and the microphones were kicked out of the building? He said, you know, we want to have better relations, and, you know, you should be aware now that we've called in your application for the embassy. Why would that have to go into a discussion about overseas trade? Unless, of course, the Chinese have made it clear that this is a test for the new UK government. So caving into them is going to be the order of the day unless we wake up and wake up fast.
Let me just try and channel my inner government, or what the government argument could be. China is a huge creditor nation. It is able to build things and do things. We need nuclear power. We need infrastructure. We need Chinese money. And isn't that the reason that Keir Starmer has made the decision he's made? He seems willing to take all the risks that you have outlined. He must be aware of the dangers of doing what he's doing. But his point is growth first at almost whatever the cost. Do you think that is the mentality of this government?
Yeah, I think they've got themselves into a mess because they wanted growth. The last thing they needed was the budget that they've just stuck on us, as we've seen now in the last 3 months. All confidence in business has collapsed. So that's the first part. If you want growth, you have to be seamless about the way you're going to do it and lower the burdens, not raise them. But all right, let's assume for a second they're in a panic now and they really do want to some way to get growth. It's not China that's going to run to our rescue. When the golden era took place, that's what George Osborne said. And we got next to nothing out of China, a bit of investment, but mostly they dumped on us everything from steel to cars, you name it. They dumped us, and massive numbers of Chinese students started coming in because we loosened up all the visa situation, and many of those came in, have actually since then gone on to work in the UK. We now discover many of them have turned out to be employed in China for nefarious reasons. All of this is what came last time, and eventually it was abandoned because it just didn't work. So they get a lot out of this because they get really unrivaled access to a market of, 60 million people. It may not seem the largest in the world, but it's a very advanced market. And all the stuff they're doing. Now we look at China. China's got financial problems, some difficulties themselves. They're desperate to get growth. When the UK government comes offering slacker checks and easier access, of course they're going to say yes, but they want their pound of flesh. And that means basically they want much easier access, fewer checks, and they can do what they like. So what we're going to get, as one example, this is what's so naive about it, is that, first of all, this ludicrous net zero objective they've got, which they're never going to achieve, but it will almost destroy some parts of the British economy, does all sorts of things, like it turns a blind eye to the solar arrays that are now shipped in from China. They are made with some parts slave labor because the polysilicon that's in there is made in Xinjiang, that is used in slave labor. The same with the innards of the big wind farms that they're doing. Much of that is made in China. Much of it is used by forced labor. All of these things they're going to now turn a blind eye to. When I ask them about net zero, which comes first, net zero or people's human rights? And they don't normally answer me on this question. And that's where the problem arises. They're just blind to this.
Have you asked Ed Miliband, the Energy Secretary, directly about this? And do you plan to?
I have. Not at the dispatch box, but I have approached him and said that the business secretary said in answer to a similar question that under his watch, no products containing slave labor would be coming into the country. I did point out to him that they're already here and they're coming in vast droves under the Environment Secretary, in this case Ed Miliband. So I then, having got that answer from him, walked over to Ed Miliband. I saw him in the lobby and I said, Ed, I don't know whether you've bothered to see what the business secretary said about not having slave labor, but your products contain massive amounts of slave labor. Does that mean you're going to stop importing them? I'll have to go talk. He disappeared off. He didn't want to answer the question. Starmer doesn't want to answer the question. They talk about not having slave labor, but they're doing it right now. And people say, well, who the hell cares? Well, we ought to care because this is the crime of all crimes, and China does it openly. They're committing genocide in Xinjiang, and yet we want to turn a blind eye to all of that. America is taking a very different line on this right now. They're toughening up their position on China and on Taiwan, and most of Europe is doing the same now. The EU has woken up to the problem that they face. They're now talking about tariffs if China wants to dump electric cars on them. What's the country that is not even looking at this at the moment? That's the UK.
Do you think that Rachel Reeves should abandon her plan to go to China early next year?
I don't see what the point of this is. All of this stuff with senior members of government going over there and kowtowing to China, and they love it over there. President Xi loves it all. Meanwhile, on the detailed stuff, they want their pound of flesh, and their pound of flesh will be things like the embassy, like their car exports, like the arrays, like the wind farms. Bear in mind, I was listening to the Home Secretary came out with a statement after this thing about the spy. And she said, oh, well, yeah, but, we have to do business with a big country. Blah, blah. We know there are issues here, but we have to work with them on the environment and net zero. And I thought to myself, what do you think China cares a damn about net zero? They build a coal-fired power station pretty much every few weeks. They are churning out this stuff at cheap energy because that is how they're going to undercut the markets. Meanwhile, we are driving ourselves into oblivion on a target that we simply can't achieve, but it will be helpful to China because we'll be buying all their product. There is a disconnect here between economic logic and national defense and security, and we seem to have abandoned the one in favor of the other, but the other will turn out to be a fistful of sand.
Do you think the Duke of York has again showed a lack of judgment?
Well, there are two things to be said about this, and I very rarely ever comment on the royals because I think they have a tough enough time as it is. But the main thing about this is I think it was a massive mistake to get him so heavily involved in the idea of promoting business and to allow that to take place almost on a parallel course to what government ministers do. They called him in and they did stuff because they thought it would help. The problem is what seems to have happened is his own team were out busy trying to make connections, and this individual has seized the opportunity to be in there. And, of course, the big talk then, when this was going on, I think this was the time of the golden era, got to get to China at all costs. This is what happens when you do that. All sorts of people think they're licensed to suddenly become experts on China. So judgment seems to have gone. The one thing I will question, though, is why aren't the security services checking royal family connections and government connections at the same time and advising them in no uncertain terms that they should cease and desist with certain individuals? There seems to be no sifting of royal connections going on much unless somebody in their team has the smarts to be able to say, do you know what, we ought to check these people out. But clearly none of that happened. And the security services knew about his actions for some time back. I suspect they've been tracking him rather than trying to kick him out. But the reality is to have him sitting as close as that to the Duke of York and then getting access to ex-prime ministers on top of the back of that, I'm sure that came off his connections. So it's easy to say it's all his fault. it's also, I think, a complete breakdown in terms of our national security profile. Why are we allowing royals to mix with people that we have suspicions about?
We should, for balance, give the Chinese embassy's reaction to this story, Sir Iain. They've denied the espionage claim, saying some individuals in the UK are always eager to fabricate baseless spy stories targeting China, and that their purpose is to smear China. Your reaction?
They always say the same thing. It's always aimed at people like me, but we're not smearing them because the intelligence agencies kicked him out, and the Home Secretary did. And so there's evidence here. I didn't get involved in this one until it was clear that this individual has been kicked out.
What should we do, just finally, Sir Iain? We've had warning after warning, not just from yourself, but from the Intelligence and Security Select Committee saying we have no strategy. Just as you say, it wasn't the Duke of York's problem alone. This should have been strategically tackled by the intelligence services, the Home Office, the Foreign Office, etc., etc. That hasn't happened. The Register of Foreign Lobbyists hasn't happened. What should the government do now, given the cyber attacks that China has undertaken against the Electoral Commission? You know, we've had lots and lots of evidence of their behaviour. What should happen?
Well, we should have a strategy. Our strategy cannot be we now must go to China for business, because that is one element of what we need to do. If we're going to do that, as they discovered in the Golden Era, badly named, but when they did that, they forgot that you need also to have even greater vigilance when you open up to these sort of markets. You must do it open-eyed and understand not just there are risks, but to identify what the risks are and how you deal with them, from cyber through to individual spying. All of that has to happen. And it's taken an age for the British government to get any kind of strategy. We began to get a strategy under the last government with the National Threats Register, all this sort of stuff. And now it's just sitting idle. And the reality is, I heard the other day that the minister said, oh, well, it's not fit for purpose, so we're going to have to take it back. That is complete rubbish. I said earlier on, anybody with half a brain knows very well it's completely doable. It was only one statute instrument away from being enacted, and they should do that straight away. If they want to make it better, by all means. If they want to tighten it up, great, more power to their elbow. But they can do that in double quick time. Sitting on it is all about not sending the bad signals to China. And we have to bite the bullet on this one and say, look, we will have to protect the British Isles and the British people, and we need to do it in a way that is very clear and obvious, and they have to play by the rules. And they don't play by the rules in China. You know, as I said earlier on, they carry out genocide. They're the biggest exporter of forced organ harvesting. You know, you just name everything about them, and this is where they play, and they don't want to obey any other sets of rules. They trash the WTO rules. They use the National Bank to invest in bids by other companies. You know, this is how they work. So we know what the risk is. Now we need to figure out how we deal with it. If you're going to open up to them, you open up, but with a very clear eye about what's going wrong. And the one strategy that should have been employed for years and years, we should have been diversifying our relationships from China. India should have been a much bigger ask for us to get to. We should have done a deal by now with India. It should be a priority. You know, Apple have moved the production of these iPhones to India now because they can't bear any longer what happens when they try and move technology there. Middle ground companies are already moving from China because their IPs get trashed, and the new laws mean that they have shadow companies being set up. This is very difficult to get any benefit from this in companies that invest in China because so often they get taken over, kicked out. So knowing all of that, our strategy should be, right, well, let's make sure other countries that can do this, that have got good education, and there are a number of them in the South Seas and in beyond in the Far East, we should be using them. Many of them members of the Commonwealth, many of them who use English common law, speak English pretty well, fantastic business location. That's where we should really be going, not back to this old tarred-flogged horse of no growth without China. China's in real economic problems at the moment. You watch what they dump on us to get their growth.
Sir Iain Duncan Smith, thank you very much indeed for joining us in the Daily Tea studio.